A quiet suburban street on a crisp autumn afternoon. The kind of neighborhood where everyone knows each other, yet sometimes the simplest acts of kindness can lead to unexpected turns. This is where our story begins, a story that challenges our assumptions and reminds us that things aren't always what they seem. As the door swung open, Mrs. Thompson stood there with a warm smile that seemed to contradict the tension of the moment. The police officers flanked her sides, but their expressions weren't stern or suspicious. They looked almost amused. Michael's father, who had positioned himself protectively in front of his family, was the first to notice the large gift basket in Mrs. Thompson's arms. "I hope you don't mind the early morning visit," Mrs. Thompson began, her voice trembling slightly with emotion. "But after what your son did yesterday, I couldn't wait another minute." She turned to the officers. "This young man right here is exactly what our community needs more of." It turned out that Mrs. Thompson had been the victim of several tech support scams over the past year, losing nearly $5,000 to fraudsters who claimed they could fix her electronics remotely. Her daughter had warned her repeatedly not to trust anyone offering tech help, especially strangers. That's why when Michael fixed her TV, she'd spent the entire night feeling conflicted about the encounter. Rather than jumping to conclusions, Mrs. Thompson had called her daughter, who suggested contacting the local police to verify if any other residents had similar experiences with the young tech-savvy neighbor. What the police discovered instead was a trail of grateful neighbors who had nothing but praise for Michael's voluntary tech assistance over the years. Officer Sarah Chen, one of the responding officers, stepped forward. Mrs. Thompson was so moved by what she learned that she wanted to do something special. She asked us to accompany her this morning, not because of any wrongdoing, but to help launch something positive for our community. The gift basket Mrs. Thompson held contained not just treats, but also a proposal. She explained how she'd stayed up all night baking and planning. "I used to be a high school teacher," she revealed, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, "and I know talent when I see it. What if we could turn this young man's skills into something bigger?" Michael's mother, who had been holding her breath since opening the door, finally relaxed her shoulders. But what Mrs. Thompson said next left everyone speechless. She pulled out a folder from beneath the gift basket, and as she opened it, several newspaper clippings fell out. Stories about elderly residents being scammed through fake tech support calls. "Our senior center has over 200 members," Mrs. Thompson continued, her voice growing stronger with excitement. "Many of them struggle with technology, making them perfect targets for scammers. But what if?" She paused, looking directly at Michael, whose confusion was slowly turning into curiosity. The police officers nodded encouragingly as Mrs. Thompson began explaining her vision. It was bigger than anyone could have anticipated, involving the local community center, the police department's cybercrime unit, and Michael's technical expertise. But before she could finish outlining her plan, a call came through on Officer Chen's radio. Another elderly resident just 3 blocks away was reporting a suspicious tech support call. The timing couldn't have been more perfect or more concerning. As everyone exchanged worried glances, they realized this situation was bigger than just one fixed television or one act of kindness. Mrs. Thompson clutched her folder tighter, her expression now a mix of determination and concern. "This is exactly why we need to act now," she declared. "But before we go any further, there's something else you all need to know." Her voice trailed off as she pulled out one final document from her folder, something that would take this story in an entirely unexpected direction. The document Mrs. Thompson pulled out was a newspaper clipping from 30 years ago. The yellowed paper showed a photo of a young black teenager helping an elderly white woman with what appeared to be an old radio set. The headline read, "Local Teens Kind Act Leads to Community Bridge Building Program." As everyone leaned in closer, Mrs. Thompson's hands trembled. "This young man," she pointed to the photograph, her voice cracking, "was my late husband's younger brother. He started a program teaching seniors about technology back in the 90s. It brought our divided community together in ways nobody expected. But after he passed away young, the program died with him." She looked up at Michael. "When you helped me yesterday, it was like seeing history repeat itself." Officer Chen's radio crackled again. The situation with scam calls was escalating. 3 more reports had come in from the senior living community. The scammers were becoming more aggressive, threatening elderly residents with computer viruses and legal action if they didn't provide immediate payment. The police department was overwhelmed trying to handle the surge in cases. Michael's father, who had been quietly observing, suddenly spoke up. "These scammers are targeting our community's most vulnerable members. They're counting on fear and isolation to succeed." He looked at his son with pride, but they didn't count on people like Michael, who remind us what community really means. The next few moments were interrupted by the arrival of Detective Rodriguez, who rushed up to the porch with an urgent update. The cybercrimes unit had traced the scam calls to a sophisticated operation targeting several neighborhoods with high senior populations. They needed to act fast, but they also needed someone who could communicate technical information in a way seniors would understand. All eyes turned to Michael, who was still trying to process everything. The weight of the moment wasn't lost on him. This wasn't just about fixing one TV anymore. Mrs. Thompson placed her hand on Michael's shoulder. "Sometimes the best way to honor the past is to build a better future. But before you decide anything, there's something else you should see." She reached into her bag one last time and pulled out another document, this one much more recent. As she unfolded it, Michael's eyes widened. The local news station had gotten wind of the situation, and they were planning to run a story about the tech support scams targeting their community. But what they didn't know yet was how a simple act of kindness was about to transform into something much bigger. Detective Rodriguez's phone buzzed with an alert. The scammers were planning their biggest operation yet, set to launch in just 2 hours. They had to make a decision fast. Mrs. Thompson's program proposal, Michael's technical skills, and the police department's resources all needed to come together immediately if they were going to protect their community's most vulnerable members. The tension on the porch was palpable as Mrs. Thompson revealed the final piece of information she'd been holding back. "Michael," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "what you don't know is that last night, while you were sleeping, something extraordinary happened in our community, and it's about to change everything." The early morning sun cast long shadows across the porch as everyone waited for Mrs. Thompson to continue. Whatever she was about to reveal would determine not just the fate of their community's seniors, but the future of everything they were hoping to build. Mrs. Thompson's voice, steady now, revealed what had transpired overnight. After Michael had fixed her TV, she posted about his kindness in the community Facebook group. Within hours, the post had gone viral locally, with hundreds of seniors sharing their own stories of being scammed. But that wasn't all. Several local tech companies had seen the post and reached out to her, offering to fund a community technology education program. These companies want to provide equipment, training space, and even internship opportunities, Mrs. Thompson explained, her eyes bright with excitement. But here's the real twist. They want you, Michael, to help design the program. They believe someone who can naturally connect with seniors is exactly what they need. Just then, Officer Chen's radio crackled with disturbing news. The scammers hadn't just been targeting their community. They'd been gathering personal information. Detective Rodriguez quickly pulled up a digital map on his tablet, showing a pattern of incidents spreading across neighboring districts. Red dots lit up the screen like a constellation of vulnerability. "We've got less than 2 hours," Detective Rodriguez stressed, "before they launch their biggest scam yet. They're planning to pose as Medicare officials, using the personal information they've gathered to make their calls seem legitimate. Hundreds of seniors could lose their life savings." Michael's mother, who had been quietly observing, suddenly gasped. She worked at the local pharmacy and had noticed an unusual number of elderly customers buying gift cards recently, a common demand from scammers. The pieces were starting to fit together, revealing a much larger conspiracy than anyone had imagined. But there was another surprise waiting. Mrs. Thompson's grandson, a software engineer in Silicon Valley, had been quietly monitoring the situation through their video call the previous night. He'd stayed up all night developing a simple app that could help seniors verify legitimate calls from scammers. All it needed was someone who could explain it in a way that seniors would understand and trust. The morning sun now fully illuminated the porch as time ticked away. Michael stood there, processing everything. the history repeating itself through Mrs. Thompson's brother-in-law's story, the tech company's offer, the immediate threat to their community's seniors, and this new app that could help protect them. But something still didn't add up. "Wait," Michael said, his voice thoughtful. "How did the scammers get all this personal information in the first place?" His question made Detective Rodriguez freeze. The officer pulled up another screen on his tablet, and what they saw made everyone's blood run cold. The scam wasn't just targeting random seniors. There was a pattern, a very specific pattern that led right back to. Mrs. Thompson's hands flew to her mouth as she realized something. "The cooking show," she whispered, "the one I was trying to watch when my TV stopped working. It wasn't just any cooking show." She reached for her phone with shaking hands, pulling up the channel guide from yesterday. What she was about to reveal would change everything they thought they knew about this situation. The group huddled closer on the porch, the gift basket now forgotten at their feet, as Mrs. Thompson's revelation threatened to blow the whole case wide open. The real question wasn't just who was behind these scams. It was why they had chosen this community, at this moment, in this particular way. Mrs. Thompson's hands shook as she showed them her TV guide. The cooking show wasn't just a regular program. It was a new series that had started broadcasting exclusively in neighborhoods with high senior populations. The show's closed captioning contained embedded code that collected data from smart TVs, gathering information about viewers' watching patterns and potentially their personal details. "That's why my TV stopped working after the storm," Mrs. Thompson realized. The power surge must have disrupted their data collection system. She turned to Michael. "When you fixed my TV, you accidentally interfered with their entire operation. That's why they're rushing their big scam. They know they've been compromised." Detective Rodriguez immediately called it in, and within minutes, the cybercrimes unit had confirmed their suspicion. The cooking show was a front, broadcasting from a local station that had recently been purchased by a shell company. The scammers had been playing a long game, gathering data for months before launching their massive fraud attempt. Michael's tech knowledge suddenly became crucial. Having worked with various TV models while helping neighbors, he quickly explained how the data collection system could be reversed to track the scammer's digital footprint. Officer Chen was already coordinating with other precincts, while Mrs. Thompson's grandson video called in to help modify his anti-scam app to include this new information. But they were racing against time. The scammer's call center was about to activate, and hundreds of seniors were at risk. That's when Michael had an idea that would change everything. "What if," he suggested, "instead of trying to stop every call, we let them make one call to us?" The next hour was a flurry of activity. The police set up a command center in Mrs. Thompson's living room, the same room where this whole story had started. Michael and Mrs. Thompson's grandson worked remotely to create a virtual phone bank that would intercept and trace the scammers' calls. Local tech companies, already interested in the community program, provided emergency resources and equipment. The plan worked better than anyone could have expected. When the scammers launched their operation, they found themselves connected to a network of police officers, cybersecurity experts, and determined community members. Within 45 minutes, their entire operation was mapped and located. The twist? They were operating from an abandoned community center just 3 blocks away. As the police moved in to make arrests, Mrs. Thompson pulled Michael aside. "Remember that newspaper clipping I showed you? About my husband's brother?" She smiled, tears in her eyes. "There's one detail I left out. That community center they're using. He helped build it. Sometimes things come full circle in ways we never expect." But the biggest surprise came during the arrests. As the police led the scammers out, one of them looked straight at Michael and said something that left everyone stunned. "We knew somebody would eventually catch us," the scammer admitted, "but we never expected it would be because of a broken TV and a kind-hearted teenager." The story could have ended there, but real life has a way of adding its own perfect endings. 1 month later, that same community center was renovated and reopened as a technology education hub, where Michael, alongside other volunteers, now teaches seniors how to protect themselves online. Mrs. Thompson serves as the program director, and her grandson's app has been downloaded by senior centers across the country. The local news did run their story, but not about the scams. Instead, they covered how an act of kindness between neighbors uncovered a criminal operation, brought a community together, and turned a moment of potential tragedy into a movement of positive change. As Michael likes to tell his students at the center, sometimes the best firewalls aren't digital, they're the connections we build with each other. The story of Michael and Mrs. Thompson didn't just fade into local legend, it sparked a movement that continued to grow in unexpected ways. 6 months after that fateful morning on the porch, their community technology center had become a model for similar programs across the state. What started with fixing one TV had transformed into something much bigger than anyone could have imagined. The renovation of the old community center became a community project itself. Local businesses, inspired by the story, donated computers and equipment. High school students volunteered alongside retired tech professionals, creating a unique blend of energy and experience. But the real magic happened in the daily interactions between generations. Mrs. Thompson still keeps that old newspaper clipping framed on the center's wall, right next to a new article featuring Michael teaching a group of seniors how to video chat with their grandchildren. History doesn't just repeat itself, she often says, sometimes it improves with each retelling. The scammers' sophisticated operation had inadvertently led to something positive. Their targeting of seniors through seemingly innocent cooking shows had exposed how vulnerable our digital lives had become. But instead of leading to fear, it led to empowerment. The center now hosts monthly tech and tea sessions where seniors learn about online safety while enjoying Mrs. Thompson's famous cookies. Michael's father, once worried about his son approaching strangers, now proudly watches as Michael helps bridge the digital divide in their community. The police department made Michael an honorary cyber safety ambassador, and his success story has encouraged other young people to volunteer their tech skills for good causes. The app that Mrs. Thompson's grandson developed has evolved too. What started as a simple scam detection tool now includes features for community connection and support. Seniors using the app can easily reach out to verified local tech helpers like Michael, creating a safe network of assistance and friendship. Perhaps the most touching outcome was the annual Community Bridge Awards program, started by the local council to recognize young people who use their skills to help others. The first award, fittingly, went to Michael, but he insisted on sharing it with Mrs. Thompson, saying, "Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is trust a stranger who offers help." The cooking show channel that the scammers had used was transformed as well. The community center now broadcasts real cooking shows created by and for local residents, where technology tips are shared alongside recipes. Mrs. Thompson hosts a popular segment called Tech Bites, where she combines her baking skills with simple technology lessons. As for Michael, he's now planning to study cybersecurity in college, with several tech companies already offering scholarships. But he still makes time to help at the center, saying that the most important firewall isn't in computers, it's in communities that look out for each other. The police officers who stood on that porch that morning still drop by the center regularly. Officer Chen often jokes that it's the only police beat where she gets freshly baked cookies during her patrol. Detective Rodriguez uses the center's success story in his cyber safety presentations, emphasizing how community connection is the best defense against digital crimes. Looking back, Michael reflects that the real story wasn't about catching scammers or even about teaching technology. It was about how trust, when given a chance, can bridge any divide. As he tells everyone who visits the center, "I just fixed a TV, but Mrs. Thompson fixed something much bigger. She fixed how we see each other." And that old TV that started it all, it sits in a special place of honor at the center, still working perfectly, broadcasting not just programs, but a reminder that sometimes the best connections aren't digital at all, they're human.